The message came through on a Tuesday, which Marcus Hale had always considered the least dramatic day of the week. He was in the galley of Waystation Carol, eating a bowl of reconstituted noodles, the kind that came from a pouch and tasted like something that had once been in the same room as actual food, when his comm chirped once, went quiet, and then chirped again in a pattern he recognized. Single burst, no header, no authentication tag, just coordinates and a room number. He'd ignored messages like that before. He'd also regretted it. The two things had happened, broadly speaking, in equal proportion, which is why he'd learned to think carefully before deciding either way. He finished the noodles first. If things went badly in the next hour, he wasn't going to be glad he'd skipped them. Room 14 Kessler was in the deep dock ring of Carol's residential tier, the part the station's commercial directory described, diplomatically, as economy accommodation, and the part that everyone who'd actually been there described as the part where the ceiling was too low, and the air recyclers made a sound like an elderly machine choosing to keep trying. The corridors down here were narrower than the upper levels, the lighting strips a cool blue-gray that turned everyone's skin the color of exhaustion, and the general atmosphere was one of transience, of beings in the middle of journeys who would rather be somewhere else and were almost there. Marcus walked the corridor at the pace of someone who didn't particularly care what he found, but intended to find it anyway. He'd learned the pace from a woman named Sergeant Delgado when he was 19, and in the second week of the most miserable training course of his life, and he'd never entirely stopped using it. Brisk looked urgent. Slow looked lost. This pace looked like he knew exactly where he was going and had decided it wasn't worth hurrying. He knocked on 14 Kessler twice, waited, knocked once more. Old habit. People who recognized the pattern answered faster. People who didn't answer at all were worth knowing about for different reasons. The door opened. She was tall, most Medusae were, the consequence of evolutionary pressure on a world where the gravity well was shallow and the canopy was high, with the characteristic coloration of her species, pale violet at the brow and the backs of the hands, deepening to something close to twilight blue at the cheekbones and along the jaw. Her eyes were a shade of gold that Marcus associated with old amber, the kind that sometimes had things preserved inside it. She wore traveling clothes rather than court dress. The distinction mattered. Court dress on a Medusa was a statement of position. Traveling clothes were something you wore when you needed to be able to move quickly and couldn't afford to care about statements. She looked him over with the deliberate patience of her species, which conducted eye contact the same way they conducted most things, as a considered act rather than a reflex. "You are Marcus Hale," she said. Her standard was precise, technically perfect, with the slight over-articulation of someone who had learned a language from recordings rather than from living inside it. The human. "Last I checked," he said, "I was told you were a protection specialist. Among other things." "Come inside," she said. He did. The room was small, with a single viewport looking out onto the docking ring's inner wall, a fold-down desk, a sleeping platform, and a chair. A travel bag was against the far wall. On the desk, something in a small travel cage shifted in the dim light, a creature about the size of a large cat, covered in fine iridescent feathers that moved through shades of copper and blue as it settled. It regarded Marcus with bright, watchful eyes and did not make a sound. "I am Sella," the woman said, "third inheritor of the Medusa Compact." Marcus had heard of the Medusa Compact. 3 systems, a consolidated trade network, an internal succession structure that made the Compact's political mechanics interesting to people who studied politics and quietly alarming to everyone else. The third inheritor was the third in the line of succession, which meant 2 people stood between her and the Compact's highest position, and at least one of those 2 people was apparently no longer standing. "I require protection," Sella said. "The HFY Silence has accepted a contract." He was quiet for a moment. The creature in the cage shifted again. Outside, somewhere in the docking ring, a pressure equalizer cycled with a deep thrumming sound that moved up through the floor into his feet. "Sit down," Marcus said. "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out on the assumption that I won't understand it. I'll stop you if I need clarification." She sat. He pulled the room's single chair to where he could see both her and the door, and he sat in it, and he listened. The Volkai Silence was not an organization that most species discussed in polite company. For the same reason they didn't discuss catastrophic atmospheric failures or the complete collapse of a ship's drive system mid-transit. Not because it was rude, but because there was a widespread and possibly superstitious belief that speaking about things capable of killing you with complete certainty brought them closer. They were an apex predator species from a system whose name translated, in most languages, to something like the system we reroute around. They had evolved over roughly 800,000 years as pack hunters in a world of complex chemical camouflage, pressure-sensitive terrain, and prey species that had developed extraordinary countermeasures over millions of years of being hunted. The result, from an evolutionary standpoint, was a species that had become extraordinarily good at patience, at reading behavioral patterns, at modeling the behavior of other creatures under stress, and at the precise, efficient application of terminal force. They had taken their skills off-world approximately 4 centuries ago, and discovered that what worked on their home planet worked even better in a galaxy full of species that had not spent millions of years developing countermeasures against them specifically. They had never, in 4 centuries of operation, failed to complete a contract. Sella told him the political situation in flat, organized sentences, the way someone told you about a crisis they'd had enough time to absorb that they were past the shaking and into the accounting. The long version: the Compact's patriarch was old and ill, and the succession had been expected to proceed in the natural order, which meant the first inheritor, then the second, then Sella as third. The first inheritor had died in what had been documented as an accident 18 months ago. The second had withdrawn from public life 6 months after that, voluntarily, officially, under circumstances that had been accepted by the Compact's council, because the alternative explanation was one that required proof that no one had been able to produce. Which left Sella, and a faction within the Compact's inner council that wanted the succession resolved on their schedule rather than the patriarchs. A faction that had spent the better part of 2 years positioning a candidate of their own, a cousin of the patriarchs, pliable and grateful, and crucially, not Sella. The faction had one problem: Sella had a witness. "His name is HSS," she said, with a slight incline of her head toward the creature in the cage. "He is a chatterling. The last of his kind on this station, and one of perhaps a few hundred remaining in this part of the galaxy." Marcus looked at the creature again. HSS looked back at him with the patient, unblinking attention of something that was recording everything. Chatterlings were a species he knew primarily by reputation. Avian in the very loose evolutionary sense, the wing architecture had been repurposed over millennia into something closer to elaborate sensory frills, and the flying had been traded for something arguably more useful. Their neurological architecture was unlike anything else Marcus was aware of. Every sound they encountered was permanently encoded, available for total and exact recall at any moment. They did not remember things the way other species remembered things, imperfectly, with degradation, with the slow erosion of time. They recorded. Every conversation, every sound, every ambient noise of every room they had ever been in was preserved in them with the fidelity of a digital archive. HSS was in the wrong room, Sella said. Approximately 11 weeks ago, on the Compact's homeworld, a meeting of the faction's inner circle took place in a private chamber that they believed to be secured against surveillance. The chamber was swept for devices before the meeting. They found and removed 7 separate recording systems. "They missed the 8th, Marcus said. HSS does not register as a recording system, Sella said. He is a small creature in a travel cage. He was in the corner because a member of the household staff had been asked to remove him from the reception area and had placed him there temporarily, intending to return for him. The meeting ran long. No one returned for HSS until it was over. What did he hear? Names, dates, explicit discussion of the methods used to remove the first and second inheritors, the amount paid to the individual who arranged the accidents, the contract with the silence, the authorization, the terms, the targets. A pause. Both targets, HSS and myself. Marcus thought about that. The faction had hired the best in the business to remove a witness, and the person the witness was protecting, and the contract was active. Why me? He asked, not fishing, a professional question. She was quiet for a moment. On the desk, HSS shifted in his cage, the feathers cycling from copper toward a deep, burnished gold. I consulted 3 security firms before sending for you, she said. 2 were Korath licensed. 1 was Searing, the 3 largest protection organizations operating in compact space. All 3 told me the same thing. They won't take a contract that puts them against the silence. In more diplomatic language, yes, she held his gaze. The silence's professional reputation depends on completion. Any firm that interferes with a silence contract becomes, effectively, the silence's next contract. No organization of sufficient size to be useful to me is willing to accept that risk. But I'm not an organization, Marcus said. You are one human, she said. With a significant documented record in situations involving, she paused, choosing the word, irregular threat profiles. Another pause. And the Volkai do not have substantial experience with humans. We're not in their database. Not in the way that most species are, she said. Your homeworld was only contacted 40 years ago. The silence has had 4 decades to build a behavioral model of your species. For most other species, they have centuries. Marcus leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The recycler made its elderly sound. Outside, the pressure equalizer cycled again. They use predictability as a weapon, he said. They model behavior. They know how each species responds to sustained threat, to physical superiority, to the certainty of the outcome. They know every pattern. Yes, Sella said. And they don't know ours well enough to be certain. No one knows yours well enough to be certain, she said carefully, and the care with which she said it suggested it was not entirely a compliment, just a true thing, honestly stated. 40 years, Marcus said almost to himself. He was thinking about 40 years of data collection on a species that had, in those 40 years, managed to show up in approximately every corner of the charted galaxy, get into more disputes and alliances and accidents than any species with only one planet of origin had any statistical right to, and consistently fail to behave in the ways that prior models suggested they should. That's not a lot of time to build a complete picture. No, Sella agreed. He looked at her. She was watching him with the amber eyes and the patience of a species that had learned patience as a survival mechanism on a world where rushing things was usually fatal. She had made her case clearly and without embellishment. She wasn't asking him to be invincible. She was asking him to be unpredictable, which was a different and arguably more honest thing. All right, he said, I'm taking the job. He stood up. First thing I need to do is walk this station. He spent the next 2 hours doing exactly what he said. He walked every corridor on their level twice. He found the maintenance shaft access points. He located the 2 freight elevators, the emergency pressure exits, the recycler access panels that were large enough to matter. He stopped in the galley at the level junction and ate another bowl of reconstituted noodles while watching who moved through the space, and how they moved, and which directions they tended to come from, and which directions they tended to go. He made a map of it in his head rather than on anything that could be found. His instructor Delgado had taught him that first. You walk a space until it stops being a space and starts being a body of water you know how to swim in. You don't need to draw the map. You need to become it. He noted 17 occupied rooms on their level. 12 species represented a Korath family with 4 children occupying adjacent rooms, 3 Syrian traders sharing a suite, a pair of Mendari academics and assorted others. Ordinary way station traffic. None of them moved in the specific, contained way that suggested professional training. He filed them in the back of his attention and kept walking. 2 rooms down from Cella's, a heavy-set alien he identified after a moment as Dorphine, a species from the outer belt, broad-shouldered, slow-moving, known primarily for commercial operations and small-scale trade, had checked in approximately 4 hours before Cella's message reached Marcus. The Dorphine had not left the room since checking in. The station's guest log, which Marcus had accessed through the public terminal at the level junction, showed that the Dorphine had also presented a gift to Cella's room, a small travel cage containing what was described as a decorative pet, a shell tortoise from the Blesk markets, with a gift tag expressing general well wishes. Marcus stood in the corridor for a moment and thought about that. He thought about the Voakai silence and their methodology. He thought about what patience looked like when you'd spent 800,000 years perfecting it. He thought about the fact that the Dorphine, or whatever was occupying that body, had checked in before Cella's message reached him, which meant before she had sent it, which meant that whoever it was had known where Cella was before she had reached out to anyone. He went back to her room. "The cage on your desk," he said. She turned from the viewport. "The welcome gift, a Blesk tortoise. I was told they are quite." "Move away from it," he said. "Slowly, don't startle it." She looked at him. Then she looked at the tortoise in its separate cage on the desk. Then she moved away from it without asking why, which elevated his opinion of her significantly. Marcus crouched in front of the cage. The tortoise was approximately 22 centimeters across, its shell the distinctive iridescent gray of the Blesk breed, with a diamond matrix pattern that caught the light in the particular way of the genuine article. It was entirely still. He examined the shell pattern for 40 seconds. Then he found the seam. It was good work. The seam was at the junction of 2 natural-looking plate segments, and the craftsmanship that had gone into matching the optical properties of the genuine shell was excellent. Not perfect. The refraction index in the artificial sections ran about 4 degrees off from what natural chitin produced, and the pattern symmetry was slightly too precise in a way that growth never quite achieved, but very good. Good enough that most people would never have looked closely enough to find it. Marcus found the release mechanism on his 4th attempt. The shell opened on a hinge. Inside, the actual tortoise long removed, replaced by a hollow housing, was a passive surveillance array about the width of his palm. Acoustic pickups, visual sensor array, 2-way environmental mapping, with what looked like a timed transmission burst cycling every 60 minutes to an encrypted short-range relay. Whoever was monitoring this device knew exactly where Cella was, knew the layout of the room in 3 dimensions, had been listening to every conversation she'd had since the cage had been delivered. Marcus set the device carefully on the floor, took a step back to make sure of the angle, and stepped on it with the heel of his boot. The crunch was satisfying in a way he allowed himself to briefly appreciate. "The Dorphine," Cella said. "Probably not actually Dorphine," Marcus said. "The silents have documented capability with physiological disguise. That's been a known capacity for at least 2 decades. He straightened. "They know you're here. They've known since before you sent for me, which means they had this location from another source. Someone in your network." Her expression didn't change. Medusa didn't display distress the way humans did. It wasn't suppression, exactly, more a different architecture of response, one that processed and contained before expressing. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted slightly. "Aven," she said, It wasn't an accusation, it was a question. Unlikely but possible, Marcus said. More likely a communication intercept at the point you booked the room or a surveillance network already in place on this station. He looked at the crushed device on the floor. They have the room. They've had it for hours. We need to move, and we need to move now. The chatterling named HSS was not in Sella's room, as it happened. He was in a safe room 2 levels up, in the station's commercial tier, a better lit, significantly more expensive section of Carol, where the recyclers were newer, and the air smelled like something had been added to it to make it smell like less of itself. Sella's steward, an elderly Medusa named Oven who had been in the household service for 40 years, was with HSS. Oven was loyal, careful, and possessed of exactly zero capability in a physical confrontation with trained operatives. Marcus found a maintenance shaft access panel behind the recycler unit in the room's small utility alcove. It was exactly wide enough to navigate if you were willing to accept that navigation was the only thing you would be doing. He went through first, confirmed the route, came back. "You'll need to leave anything you can't carry in one bag," he told Sella. She had already repacked. She took the bag without being told to take it. She went into the shaft without being told it was going to be unpleasant. He followed with HSS's travel cage, which was exactly as awkward as it looked, and also, it turned out, slightly heavier than it looked. HSS, for his part, was silent and completely calm. Chatterlings, Marcus recalled, had evolved in dense forest canopy and had a generalized comfort with enclosed, darkened spaces that most other species lacked. He navigated the cage through a particularly tight junction, and HSS made a small sound, not distress, he thought, but something more like observation. "You are larger than you appear in the file," HSS said. The voice was extraordinary, standard delivered with the exact cadence and intonation of a Medusa speaker, because that was who HSS had learned the language from. "There's a file," Marcus said. "3 files," HSS said. "Separate. I have heard them read aloud. The third is the most complete. It notes your operation on Pella's IV, the incident at the Korath relay station in the 7th belt, and the situation on the colony vessel Endurance 7. All of those are confidential records," Marcus said. "Yes," HSS agreed pleasantly. "I heard them read to Sella 7 weeks ago, when she was determining whether to contact you." Marcus considered that as he hauled himself through a junction. 7 weeks ago meant she'd been researching him since before the silence contract was finalized, which meant she'd started contingency planning earlier than she'd implied, which meant she was either more methodical than she appeared or more frightened than she appeared, and he suspected both. "What does the third file say about the Pella's IV situation?" he asked, because he was curious what version had made it into a private dossier. "It says you resolved a hostage situation involving 11 hostages and 4 armed Korath separatists in a decommissioned processing facility, resulting in 11 survivors and 0 casualties among the hostages," HSS said. "It notes that you were unarmed at the commencement of the operation." "I had a fire suppression canister and a very strong opinion," Marcus said. "This is not in the file," HSS said. "No, I imagine not." They reached the junction that gave access to the residential tier's upper levels, and Marcus held position for 40 seconds, listening to the sounds of the space above, the particular acoustic signature of a corridor occupied by ordinary civilian traffic, which had a rhythm to it, a texture of footsteps and conversation, an ambient mechanical noise that changed when it was broken by something that didn't belong. He listened to it until it told him it was ordinary, and then he moved. Oven opened the safe room door before Marcus had finished knocking. The old Medusa's eyes moved immediately from Marcus to Sella to the cage Marcus was carrying, and then to the corridor behind all of them. And Marcus was pleased, in a professional way, by the order of those assessments. "We have been compromised," Sella said. "How long?" Oven asked. Uncertain, at least 4 hours. Marcus set HSS's cage on the room's table and straightened. We need to move everyone to the ship tonight. What's the status of the berth? Pre-flight cleared, Alvin said. Base 7. The fuel load is complete. We can depart in approximately 40 minutes if we can reach the bay. Base 7 is accessible through the main freight corridor, Marcus said. That was the problem. The main freight corridor was the most observable route on the station, long, well-lit, with no secondary access. Anyone watching the docking ring's entry points would see them coming from 200 meters away. I need a different route. He thought about his 2 hours of walking, the freight elevator from the maintenance level, the exterior service walkway that connected the secondary dock ring to the primary, the EVA suit locker at Junction 7C, which he'd noted because lockers of that type in that location were always there for a reason. How's everyone with a suit? He asked. Alvin looked at the age spots on the backs of his own hands for a moment. I managed the exterior maintenance walk on the Patriarch's vessel once, he said. I was 40 years younger. But I managed. HSS, Marcus said. I have been in a vacuum environment 3 times, HSS said from the cage. The feathers had shifted to a deep bronze. I did not enjoy it. I did enjoy surviving it. That's essentially the right attitude, Marcus said. He turned to Sella. You. I have basic EVA certification, she said. Standard compact requirement for diplomatic travel. Good. He looked at all of them. EVA suits will be bulky and the external walkway will be slow. We'll have a window of about 12 minutes between the station's exterior sensor sweeps where we can move without triggering the automated safety protocols. Once we're at Base 7, we have 40 minutes to pre-flight and depart before the window closes on our departure lane. And if the Silence has operatives at the bay already, Orvin asked. Then we deal with that when we get there, Marcus said. You don't plan for the obstacle you expect. You plan to be capable of handling the obstacle you don't. HSS made the small observational sound again. Sergeant Delgado, he said. Marcus looked at the chatterling. What? That formulation, HSS said. I heard it read from your service record. It was attributed to your training instructor. Sergeant Delgado, 1st Planetary Defense, retired. You read my training record. I heard it read, HSS corrected, with the precision of something for whom the distinction genuinely mattered. 7 weeks and 4 days ago. I remember it completely. Everything, Marcus said. Everything, HSS agreed. The feathers shifted back toward copper, including what I heard in the chamber 11 weeks ago, including the voices, including what was said. A pause. I have been very careful not to reproduce any of it until the appropriate time. The appropriate time being an arbitration council, Marcus said. Yes, although Sella told me that appropriate times sometimes have to be built before you can use them. The bird's head tilted, very slightly, in a way that reminded Marcus of something he couldn't immediately place. She also said that finding the right human was part of building the appropriate time. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at Sella. She was looking back at him with the amber eyes and the patience, and she didn't say anything, and he thought about 7 weeks of research and a file with 3 components, and the choice to send a message without a header to a man eating reconstituted noodles on a Tuesday evening, and he thought that whatever else she was someone who planned very carefully in the quiet spaces between things. Right, he said. Let's get to the suit locker. They didn't make it to the suit locker. They made it to the junction 30 meters from the suit locker, which was where the corridor opened into a wider passage connecting the commercial tier to the maintenance level, and where 3 figures were waiting with the complete stillness of organisms that had spent geological timescales perfecting the art of waiting in the dark. Marcus saw them before the others did. Not because he was faster or had better eyes, but because he'd been counting his steps and knew that at this junction, at this time of the evening cycle, There should have been ambient noise from the cargo processor 3 corridors over, a consistent mechanical rhythm that had been running every time he passed through the area in the last 2 hours. It had stopped. Something had changed in the acoustic environment, which meant something in the environment had changed. He stopped walking. He held his hand back, palm out. Everyone stopped. The Volkai female at the center of the group was approximately 2.5 meters of evolutionary conclusion, the result of every competitive pressure her species had ever faced, all of it written into the architecture of her body. Bipedal, because bipedalism turned out to be useful for species that developed tool use. But the skeletal structure was different from the baseline. The joints moved differently, with more range and less warning. The coloring was a deep, non-reflective gray that was actively difficult to track in the dim corridor lighting. Not a conscious choice, but a biological inheritance from ancestors that had hunted in conditions where visibility was a disadvantage. Her eyes were large and positioned laterally, not quite the full side-of-the-head placement of pure prey animals, not quite the front-facing configuration of pure predators, but something in between that gave her a visual field Marcus couldn't precisely calculate and didn't especially want to know empirically. The 2 males behind her were broadly similar, slightly different in proportion, same quality of absolute stillness. They looked at Marcus and his small group with the particular attention of organisms that had never particularly needed to look around nervously, because nothing in their evolutionary history had ever given them a reason to. Alvin said very quietly, "There is no route around." Sella had her hand on HSS's cage, and her body angled between the cage and the corridor, which Marcus noted and filed away for what it said about her priorities. He had 3 people behind him, one of whom was elderly, one of whom was contained in a cage, and one of whom was an alien noblewoman with basic EVA certification and a diplomatic travel background. He had, in terms of physical assets, a data chip in his jacket pocket, the knowledge of every corridor on this level, and approximately 40 years of accumulated experience in situations where the logical outcome was very bad. He thought about his instructor saying, "The body knows you're in danger before you do. Your job isn't to convince it otherwise. Your job is to decide what you're doing with the information." He took a breath, let it out. Then he stepped forward. Not back, not sideways. Forward toward the 3 Volkai, into the space between them and him, which was the wrong move by every behavioral model that had ever been developed about how prey species responded to apex predators in confined spaces. Every model said, maximize distance, seek exit, prepare for flight or submission. The female's head tilted, just slightly, the fraction of a degree that Marcus had been hoping for. He kept walking, slower now, steady, the way you walked toward a fire, not enthusiastically, not reluctantly, just with the particular quality of attention that said you understood exactly what you were walking toward and had decided to do it anyway. "I want to make you an offer," he said. His voice came out steady, which was a small victory he allowed himself to note and then set aside. The female's eyes tracked him with the lateral precision of something that had evolved to track prey across a wide field. She said something in Volkai, a sequence of sounds that moved through registers Marcus couldn't fully parse, with the subharmonic resonance that HSS had mentioned. "Standard," Marcus said pleasantly. "I don't speak Volkai." A pause, brief, assessing. "You are the protection," she said. Her standard was differently inflected than Sella's, flatter in some registers, with a precision that suggested translation software rather than learned speech. "One human. We are 3 silence-trained under contract. We have never." "Failed a contract," Marcus said. He stopped walking. He was standing roughly equidistant between the 3 Volkai and his own group, in the most tactically inadvisable position he could have chosen, and the muscles in his legs were doing something that he'd learned to recognize as the preparatory stage of the adrenaline sequence, and he was letting them do it because there was no point in fighting it, and because some part of him, the deep, old part that had been in enough situations like this to know the particular texture of them, was completely and entirely calm. Fear and calm, he'd learned, were not opposites, they were simultaneous. "I know your record," he said. "4 centuries, 0 incomplete contracts. I read the summary file on the transit here." He took his hands out of his pockets slowly, visible, empty. "Here's what I want to offer you. Step back. 1 step right now, and then we talk." The male on the right shifted his weight, preparing. But the female took 1 step back. It was small, perhaps 20 centimeters, and it happened in the brief window before her conscious mind caught up with her hindbrain, and Marcus saw it for exactly what it was. The response of an organism that had just encountered stimulus that did not fit its model, and whose ancient predator instinct had flagged the anomaly as potential danger before the rational assessment could reassure it that the anomaly was just a single unarmed human in a corridor. 20 centimeters was everything. "Here's what I know," Marcus said. He spoke at the same pace he used for everything, unhurried, without performance. "I know there's a surveillance device that used to be in a tortoise shell on the desk in room 14 Kessler. It's not there anymore. It's about 67 pieces of it on the floor, which means your real-time situational picture of that room is gone." He watched the female's face and didn't let himself watch the male's, because if he started watching all 3 of them at once, he'd never be watching any of them enough. "I know you came to this station with a team of at least 3, and that one of you has been operating under Dorphine cover near our accommodation level. I know your team's acoustic signature because HSS has been recording every sound on our level since this morning, including the subharmonic resonance in your comms, and everything he records is permanent and total recall." A silence. "I know," he continued, "that the people who contracted you are going to be arrested. That's not a threat. It's a timeline. The Compact's Arbitration Council has already received a preliminary filing. It went through 30 minutes ago from a relay I set up before I came to Sella's room. The evidence it references is what HSS recorded 11 weeks ago in a chamber on the homeworld. The full testimony will follow when we reach a secure arbitration channel, which we intend to reach tonight." He paused. "Your clients are done. The question is whether the silence fulfills a contract for clients who are already, operationally, exposed and finished, which means a completed contract that becomes public record in an arbitration proceeding and documents your involvement with an exposed criminal faction, or whether the silence identifies, as a professional matter, that the contract parameters have been materially misrepresented." The female was very still, the stillness of something that was processing rather than waiting. "Misrepresented," she said. "They hired you to remove a witness and a protected subject," Marcus said. "Standard contract as far as you knew. What they did not disclose was that the witness had already transmitted a preliminary record, that the arbitration filing was already in progress, and that completing the contract would not, in fact, prevent the testimony, only delay it slightly while adding an obstruction charge and a very specific connection between your organization and the faction." He tilted his head slightly. "You model behavioral patterns, so model that one." The male on the left said something, rapid in vokai. "Translation," Marcus said, without looking away from the female. "He says you may be constructing a false picture," HSS said from behind Marcus. "He says the filing may not exist. He says the relay may not have occurred." "He might be right," Marcus said agreeably. "That's what makes this interesting." He held up the data chip between 2 fingers. "What's on this is real. Every conversation HSS recorded in that chamber, every name, every date, every amount paid, every instruction given, it's all here. And it goes to 4 separate destinations, automatically, if none of us checks in within the next 48 hours. He watched the female. "The question isn't whether your model of me is accurate. The question is whether you're willing to bet your organization's 4th-century reputation on the assumption that I'm bluffing. The corridor was very quiet. Marcus stood in it, heart rate approximately 142 beats per minute by his own rough count, hands steady by an act of will that he wasn't going to examine too carefully, genuinely and thoroughly afraid in the way he was always afraid in situations like this. The fear fully present, fully acknowledged, fully noted by the part of his brain that dealt in survival assessment. And set aside, not gone, set aside. The female turned to the males, a rapid exchange that Marcus did not attempt to follow. He watched her posture instead, the way her weight shifted, the quality of the communication, whether it was the compressed efficiency of decision-making or the elongated patterns of argument. It was the former. She turned back. "The silence operates on verified information," she said, "if your claim regarding the contract parameters is accurate." "It is," Marcus said. "Then the contract as accepted is voidable under our own operational code," she said. "We do not fulfill contracts that have been structured to instrumentalize us in the exposure of our own clients." A pause. "We will require verification of your claims, independent verification." "Of course," Marcus said. "What timeline do you need?" 12 hours. "You have 12 hours, he said. "We'll be off this station before then, which means you'll have 12 hours where we're no longer your immediate problem regardless. If your verification confirms what I've told you, the contract is void and we never need to discuss this again. If it doesn't confirm it," he shrugged one shoulder, "then you know where I eat noodles on Tuesdays. I'll be there." Something moved in the female's face that was not quite any expression Marcus had a word for. It was brief, the duration of a single breath, and then her posture shifted, fractionally, from the coiled quality of readiness toward something else. "Proceed," she said. Marcus walked past them. He walked at the same pace he'd walked toward them, unhurried, without looking back, toward the suit locker that was 30 meters behind the 3 Voakai who were turning slowly, to watch a single human in a corridor walk away from them the same way he'd walked toward them. Behind him, after a moment, he heard 3 sets of footsteps, going the other direction. He let out a breath. "That was," Alvin said quietly, from somewhere to his left, "the most alarming thing I have witnessed in 40 years of service." "Were you watching?" Marcus asked. "I could not have looked away," Alvin said. HSS made the small sound. "You were afraid," HSS said. "I recorded the elevation in your vocal register, the micro-tremor in your breathing pattern." "Yes," Marcus said. "But you walked toward them." "Yes." A pause. "I don't understand," HSS said, and the way he said it suggested he was being completely literal, that the gap between what he'd recorded and what he understood was genuine. "I know," Marcus said. "That's actually the whole point." They made the ship in 41 minutes. The EVA walk was as unpleasant as Marcus had expected, and Alvin managed it without complaint, which Marcus filed away as information about what 40 years of service to a demanding household produced in a person. HSS was silent in the suit-adapted carrier that Sella had, with impressive forethought, packed in her single bag. Bay 7, when they reached it, was empty. They were off station in 38 minutes. The verification the silence conducted took 11 hours. Marcus spent most of them in the ship's compact crew quarters, doing the specific kind of sleeping that happened after extended adrenaline events, deep and complete, with the total absence of dreams that his body had learned to produce when it needed actual recovery rather than just rest. He woke to Sella standing in the doorway with something hot in a container. "Tea," she said. "Medusai preparation. It is not unpleasant for most human palates according to what I have read." He sat up and took it. It was not unpleasant. It tasted like something that had grown in a place with very clear air and was proud of it. The silence has suspended the contract, she said. Already. The faction's financial records were less clean than they believed. Once the silence began pulling the threads, she sat down in the doorway, which was too narrow for sitting comfortably, but she did it anyway, in the manner of someone who had not slept and did not intend to fall over. 3 of the inner council are already under monitoring by compact intelligence for separate matters. The money trail to the silence contract was found in 4 hours. They always think they're more careful than they are, Marcus said. Yes. She held her own container of tea with both hands and looked at the viewport, which showed the steady transit of stars on a clear sky jump. HSS will testify before the arbitration council the day after tomorrow. Everything he recorded is being transmitted to the council's secure archive in segments as we travel. When we arrive, it will be complete. And then the faction's leadership will be in custody. The succession will proceed on the patriarch's own timeline. A pause. And I will owe a significant professional debt to a human who ate noodles on a Tuesday. The rate was competitive, Marcus said. It was, she agreed. That is not what I mean. He drank the tea. Outside, the stars moved. When you stepped toward them, she said, and then stopped. She seemed to be deciding something. I have spent significant effort in my life understanding threat response, how species behave under existential pressure. I have read the studies. I understand the general literature. She looked at him. Nothing in that literature prepared me for watching a human walk toward 3 HFY silence operatives in a confined corridor. It usually surprises people, he said. The HFY female stepped back, Sela said. 1 step. Before you had finished your first sentence, she stepped back from a single unarmed human who was walking toward her. The model hiccuped, Marcus said. Explain that. He thought about how to explain it. He'd thought about how to explain it before, in other contexts, and never quite found the right framing that didn't sound like philosophy or mythology. They've been modeling behavioral responses to threat for centuries, he said. Every species they've encountered, they've built a pattern for, how it responds to the certainty of superior force, how fear escalates and expresses, at what point the calculus tips from fight to flight to freeze. They're very good at this, and the models are very accurate because living things that evolved under predation pressure have deep biological consistency in their fear responses. He turned the tea container in his hands. We have that too. The fear is real, completely physical. But somewhere in our history, something happened where the fear response and the action response got decoupled. We can be afraid and still choose what we do with the fear. It doesn't translate automatically into flight or freeze or fight. We look at the situation and we decide. All species decide, Sela said. Not like this, Marcus said. Not in the middle of maximum threat with the fear fully present and fully acknowledged and just set it aside. Note it, use the information it's giving you and then do something else. He paused. It probably looks like malfunction from the outside, like a broken threat response. When you're modeling prey behavior and the prey keeps doing the wrong thing, the first interpretation is system error. And by the time the correct interpretation is available, Sela said slowly, the moment has changed. The window's open, he said. You only need a few seconds. She was quiet for a while. The ship moved through the quiet transit of stars. Somewhere in the forward section, HSS was presumably recording the sound of travel, the hum of the drive, the tick of the hull adjusting to temperature variance, the particular silence of space as filtered through walls designed to keep it out. The compact security assessment, Sela said at last, has categorized humans as a low-priority species for strategic concern, new to the contact network, single planet of origin. No significant military establishment at interstellar scale. 40 years of observation indicating a generally cooperative, somewhat unpredictable but manageable profile. That sounds about right, Marcus said. I am going to recommend a revision, she said. He almost smiled. What kind of revision? I am not yet certain of the language, she said, but something in the direction of, do not confuse the absence of the expected pattern for the absence of capability. He finished the tea. It was, on reflection, significantly better than reconstituted noodles. He filed that away as something to possibly investigate further if there were future Tuesdays that called for it. The Arbitration Council chamber was large in the way that official spaces were always large, designed to make individuals feel appropriately small in the face of institutional weight. High ceilings, tiered seating, a floor that echoed in a way that made every footstep an announcement. It smelled of formal occasions and the particular kind of air that had been filtered too many times and lost any character it once had. HSS stood on the testimony platform, a small, brilliant creature in a space built for beings 3 times his size, and reproduced everything. It was extraordinary to watch. Marcus sat in the observer's gallery next to Oven, who had produced tea from somewhere with the practicality of someone who had attended many long proceedings, and he watched HSS fill the formal chamber with the exact voices of people who had believed, 11 weeks ago, that their words were permanent only in their own memories. Every conversation, every name, the specific inflection of the faction's senior member when she had said the amount and the contractor and the target and the timeline, the precise syntax of the authorization, the moment when one of the inner circle had made a small joke in poor taste about the precision of silence work, and all the others had laughed, and the laughter was there too, preserved, exact, 11 weeks old and completely present. The faction's representatives in the gallery did not make a sound. The chatterlings, Oven said quietly during a procedural pause. Their species was hunted 3 times to near extinction by 3 separate powers who understood what it meant to have perfect witnesses in the universe. He held his tea with the care of someone who had learned to make careful use of small comforts. Each time they survived by giving the right testimony at the right moment, not through force, not through numbers, through the specific, irreplaceable thing they were. A pause. It has always struck me as a very particular kind of courage, to be the witness, to refuse to forget. Marcus thought about HSS in the maintenance shaft, navigating the dark in a carrier, recording the sounds of transit. He thought about HSS in room 14 Kessler, behind him, translating the Voakai male's skepticism in a voice that didn't shake. He thought about the specific quality of courage that didn't involve walking toward anything, that just involved being there and remembering. Not unlike your own, Oven said mildly. I walk toward things, Marcus said. HSS doesn't need to, he just needs to be present. Yes, Oven said. Different shapes of the same thing, perhaps. During the recess, Marcus found a spot near the back of the gallery where the wall met a support column, put his back to the column, and stood there for 20 minutes without doing anything in particular, except watching the chamber empty and refill and empty again in the patterns of procedural interval. The compact security detail was visible at the main entrances. 4 officers in the formal gray of the directorate, capable-looking and clearly briefed, moving with the particular attentiveness of professionals who had been told something significant was happening today. Marcus watched them work the room and made no judgments about their competence and no assumptions about the adequacy of their coverage. He was, by all professional measures, off the clock. Sella was inside a formally convened arbitration proceeding with full council authority and a security detail and walls that had been swept 3 times this morning. His contract was, effectively, complete. He could be eating something better than reconstituted noodles right now, or sleeping, or doing any of the reasonable things that a person who had spent the last 36 hours in various maintenance shafts and EVA suits had earned the right to do. He stood at the wall and watched the exits. It was not anxiety. He'd examined that distinction carefully over the years, the difference between the professional habit of attention and the compulsive behavior of someone who couldn't turn off the threat assessment function. The habit was voluntary. He could set it down when he chose to set it down. Right now he was choosing not to, because the faction's inner council hadn't all been in the chamber when the testimony began, and the Compact's directorate hadn't yet confirmed the arrest of all known associates, and the window between the proceeding is happening, and the proceeding is complete, and the outcome is secured, was exactly the window that people in desperate circumstances sometimes tried to use. No one used it. The testimony proceeded without incident, which was, he had always thought, the least celebrated and most important outcome in protection work. Oven appeared at his elbow with tea that he had once again produced from somewhere Marcus hadn't seen, and Marcus accepted it, and they stood together at the column for a while without talking. "You have done this for a long time," Oven said finally. It was not quite a question. 23 years, Marcus said, roughly. "And before that?" "Before that, I did a different version of the same thing, for a different kind of employer." He drank the tea. "Military, planetary defense, then secondment to an off-world advisory unit. Then I stopped working for the institution and started working for the outcome. The distinction being, institutions care whether the paperwork is right," Marcus said. "The outcome just needs to happen." He paused. "I preferred the second kind of caring. Turned out other people did too, hence the career." Oven made a small sound that Marcus had learned, in 48 hours of proximity, was his version of acknowledgement. The elderly Medusei watched the chamber below with the settled attention of someone who had attended many long proceedings in the service of someone else's future, and who had made his peace, a long time ago, with that particular shape of a life. "She has been afraid," Oven said. "These past weeks. Not visibly, she would not permit it to be visible, it would not serve her purpose, but I have known her for 22 years, since she was a child." He paused. "She has not been afraid in the way she was afraid these past weeks since her sister, the first inheritor since the accident." Marcus waited. He'd learned in 23 years that the space after a sentence like that one was sometimes the most important space in a conversation. "The first inheritor was the one who should have been here," Oven said. "She would have managed this differently, more openly, more politically. She had gifts in those directions that Sella does not have, and Sella knows it and spends some portion of every day knowing it." He drank his tea. "What Sella has instead is a specific kind of clarity. She does not panic. She does not catastrophize. She finds the next move and she makes it, and then she finds the one after that." "She found me 7 weeks before she needed me," Marcus said. "Yes." Oven glanced at him briefly. "That is what I mean. She could not know 7 weeks ago precisely what the threat would look like or when it would materialize. She knew that something was coming and that when it came, she would need someone who could not be modeled." He looked back at the chamber. "She was, I think, more afraid of making the wrong choice about who to trust than she was of the silence themselves." Marcus thought about that. He thought about the 3 files and the 7 weeks and the room number sent without a header. He thought about Sella in the maintenance shaft, pulling herself along the access rungs in traveling clothes without a sound, and Sella angling her body between HSS's cage and the corridor when the Vokai appeared, and Sella in the doorway of the crew quarters with tea and the first question she'd trusted herself to ask directly. "She made the right choice," Marcus said. "Yes," Oven said, "she generally does. Eventually. The cost is that she carries the weight of having to be certain before she acts." A pause. "Watching you walk toward those operatives without certainty, I think that was genuinely new information for her, about what it was possible to do without certainty." "It's possible to do most things without certainty," Marcus said. "Certainty is expensive and usually unavailable." "Most species," Oven said mildly, "do not appear to have internalized this." Marcus finished his tea. Below, the recess was ending. The council members were filing back to their seats, and the security detail was repositioning, and HSS was returning to the testimony platform with the bright-eyed, unflappable composure of a creature that had been carrying this weight for 11 weeks and was now, finally, setting it down in the right place. Most species have better options than we started with, Marcus said. When you're small and you've only got one planet and every larger civilization in the contact network has had centuries to build advantages you haven't, you either learn to operate under uncertainty or you don't operate. He stood up from the column. We learned. The proceedings took the rest of the day. By evening, the faction's inner council was in temporary custody pending the full proceeding. The succession protocols were formally suspended pending the Patriarch's natural timeline, which the court physician estimated at 1 to 3 years, a span of time that was, in political terms, long enough for things to stabilize. 3 of the inner council's funding networks were frozen. Marcus filed his professional report short, factual, without the adjectives that the events might technically have warranted in the corridor outside the chamber. He flagged the surveillance device, the Dorphine cover identity, the contact at the way station, the resolution. He filed the rate invoice. He noted that the contract had been completed and closed. He was putting his comm away when Sela found him. She was in court dress now, the formal deep violet layers of Medusei diplomatic presentation, and she stood very straight the way her species always did, and she looked at him with the amber eyes that had been watchful and calculating for every hour since room 14 Kessler and were now, for the first time, something else. Not relaxed. He didn't think Sela relaxed in quite the way he understood the word, but settled, like water that had been disturbed and had found its level. I have submitted my recommendation to the Compact's Security Directorate, she said. The revised human assessment. Yes, a pause. I also submitted a secondary recommendation regarding the retention of independent protection specialists with cross-species conflict experience. That sounds like a policy document, Marcus said. It is. Your name appears in the supporting materials section. He looked at her, as an example of what to look for or as a candidate. As a reference for the profile of capability the Compact has been underestimating, she said. Whether you choose to act on any subsequent inquiry is, of course, your own decision. Fair enough, he said. She was quiet for a moment. In the corridor around them, the formal traffic of post-proceeding movement continued. Aides and representatives and security staff navigating the aftermath of an event that had been, from the outside, bureaucratic and procedural, and not at all the shape of what it had actually been. I want to ask you something, Sela said. Go ahead. When you stepped toward them, she said, in the corridor, was there a moment between deciding to do it and doing it where you understood that it might not work? Yes, he said. And you stepped forward anyway? Yes. Why? He thought about how to answer that. Not because the answer was complicated. It was actually very simple, but because the simple answer never quite captured the full shape of the thing. Because the alternative was certainty, he said. If I stepped back, if I froze, if I did any of the things the model expected, I was certain to lose. The thing about walking toward them was that I wasn't certain to lose. I wasn't certain to win either, but uncertainty was the only resource I had. Sela held his gaze for a long moment. 40 years, she said softly. Since first contact, the Compact has had 40 years to assess your species and has concluded, low priority, cooperative, manageable. That's what the file says, Marcus said. The file is wrong, she said. He picked up his bag. He had a transport connection to catch, and there was, he knew, an unremarkable transit station on the transfer route with a galley that was marginally better than the one on Carol, and he had formed, in the last 36 hours, a new opinion of what constituted an acceptable standard for noodles. Tell your friends, he said. And he walked, at the pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had decided it wasn't worth hurrying, toward the next door and the next room number, and whatever was waiting on the other side of it. The HFY Silence filed no public record of Waystation Carol. They were not an organization that made public records of anything. But their internal files, maintained with the precision of organisms for whom record-keeping was a survival mechanism, included a new entry in their anomalous encounter category. The entry was brief: station designation, date, contract status, resolution. And at the bottom, in the controlled vocabulary of risk classifications that the Silence had developed over 4 centuries, the notation. The word was the same one they had used for every human encounter that had ended outside the expected parameters. They had added it to their vocabulary 200 years ago, after the first such encounter, and had debated among themselves whether it was a single aberration or a pattern. Over 2 centuries and approximately 40 documented encounters with human subjects, the debate had resolved. It was a pattern. The word translated in Standard as unpredictable. That was the loose translation, the one that made the thing sound manageable, even mildly interesting, like a variable in a model that just needed more data. The precise HFY term carried more specificity. It meant a creature that continues past the point at which all modeled threat responses predict cessation. It meant an organism in which the coupling between fear and action has been severed or never existed. It meant, in the most literal and accurate rendering, the thing that walks toward you. The Silence were not easily frightened. They were experienced, highly trained, and had spent centuries encountering things larger and faster and more numerous than themselves, and had adapted to all of them. Fear, as they understood it, was information, useful, relevant, to be processed and integrated. They processed the entry, they integrated it. They filed it under the category that the precise term indicated. And they made a note, which was also standard practice for the anomalous category, regarding what they would do differently if a contract involving a human protection specialist arose in the future. The note was short. It said, increase initial distance. It said, do not rely on standard behavioral models. It said, if the subject walks toward you, reassess immediately. The file was closed. The system moved to the next item. The work continued. And on a transit station somewhere between compact space and the outer corridor routes, on a Tuesday evening by the calendar he kept in his head, Marcus Hale found a galley with actual noodles and sat down and ate them, and thought about the next comm that would chirp without a header, and where it would send him this time. The noodles were good. He left a tip. He walked out into the recycled air of another station that didn't know what had just happened in the spaces between its corridors, and he stood for a moment in that particular quality of in-between that transit stations always had, the accumulated residue of 10,000 journeys, filtered and refiltered, still faintly present. His comm buzzed, new message, no header. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it away and kept walking. He'd read it in the morning. Tonight he was going to sleep, actually sleep, in a room without a maintenance shaft he'd need to know the layout of. But his feet knew which direction the exits were, and his mind was already making the preliminary assessment of the acoustic environment, and somewhere in the part of him that had been doing this for a very long time, the thing that his instructor Delgado had tried to put into words and never quite managed, the decoupling, the decision that fear was information and not instruction, was running quietly, steadily, without drama. Ready. Afraid. Going anyway.